You've probably never stopped to think about why a stranger's father at a graduation can make your throat tighten without any warning. You're watching someone you don't even know get hugged by a man who showed up, and something in your chest does something you can't quite explain. Or you've watched someone scream and cry and beg to keep a relationship together, and instead of feeling sympathy, you felt this strange, quiet envy. Not because you wanted the pain, but because at least someone cared enough to stay and fight for them. That feeling has a name, and this video is going to explain exactly what it is, where it comes from, and what it's been quietly doing to your life ever since. Here's something almost nobody talks about. Roughly 1 in 4 children in the United States grows up without a present, involved father. 1 in 4. That number is far higher than most people assume, and yet the experience almost always feels isolating, like something you carry alone because nobody around you was naming it. Most people who've lived this assume their situation was unusual. It wasn't. It just felt invisible. So what did that absence actually do to you? Most people assume the answer is straightforward. A missing parent equals a missing piece of love. But the real mechanism is stranger and more specific than that, and almost none of it gets discussed in the typical conversation about father wounds. We're going to go through the actual psychology here, including some findings that most content on this topic completely skips over, and by the end of this, you're going to understand yourself in a way you probably haven't before. Start with your body, because this is where almost everyone begins the story too late. Researchers studying evolutionary biology have found something genuinely unexpected. When a father is absent, a child's body can interpret that absence as an environmental signal, a sign that the world around them is unpredictable or scarce. In some studies, this has been linked to earlier physical development in children, as if the body decided it couldn't afford to wait. This isn't psychological. This is biological. Your body may have responded to the absence before your mind ever had words for it, before you were old enough to even ask where he was. What that means is that part of what happened to you wasn't a story you constructed. It was a signal your nervous system received and acted on, completely outside your control, long before you had any say in the matter. And that matters, because a lot of people spend years treating this as a personal failure, something they should have been stronger than. But your nervous system was doing exactly what it was designed to do. It was adapting to the environment it was given. But here's something most psychology content quietly skips over, and it's a gap that I think does real damage. Researchers have historically lumped together very different kinds of father absence as if they were all the same thing. A father who died. A father who left after a divorce. A father deployed for years at a time. A father who stayed in the house but was never emotionally present at all. These get studied as if they produce identical outcomes, even though the lived experience of each one is almost certainly different in ways that matter. Why does that distinction matter to you specifically? Because if you've ever felt like your situation didn't quite match the descriptions you read online, that's not because you were broken or different in some shameful way. It's because most of the research was never built to capture the actual texture of what you went through. Think about how differently those 4 situations actually feel from the inside. A father who died leaves grief, but rarely leaves the question of whether you were wanted. A father who left after a divorce leaves something different entirely, a question that often centers on choice, on the idea that he could have stayed and decided not to. A father who was deployed for years at a time creates something closer to a slow, repeated separation, an absence that returns and leaves again, which trains a different kind of nervous system response than a single, final departure. And a father who stayed in the house but was never truly present, that one leaves perhaps the strangest wound of all, because there is no clean story to tell, no single moment of leaving, just years of reaching towards someone who was technically there and somehow still completely out of reach. If your experience was that 4th kind, you may have spent years feeling like you didn't have the right to call it a wound at all. After all, he was there. He came home every night. But presence without attunement is its own particular kind of absence, and it deserves to be named as clearly as any of the others. The fact that he was physically in the building doesn't mean you had a father in the way that actually counts. And here's one more blind spot worth naming. A significant portion of the foundational research on father absence relied on samples that were mostly white and middle class. That means much of what gets repeated as established fact about father wounds may not generalize cleanly across different backgrounds and communities. If your experience doesn't match what you've read, the data has a gap, not you. So what actually happened inside you during those years? Because this is where the real mechanism lives. Children don't process absence the way adults do. An adult missing someone thinks, that person isn't here. A child missing someone often arrives at a completely different conclusion. A child thinks, I must not be worth staying for. That single distinction changes everything that follows, because one is a fact about another person, and the other becomes a fact about you. And once a belief like that takes root in a child's mind, it doesn't stay contained to childhood. It follows you into every room you enter as an adult, every relationship you build, every moment someone gets close enough that losing them would actually hurt. Psychologist Mary Ainsworth, who pioneered attachment theory through years of observing how children respond to separation from caregivers, found that early relationships create a working model the child carries forward, a kind of internal map for what closeness is supposed to feel like. Her research involved something deceptively simple. She would observe a child playing in a room, have the caregiver leave briefly, then return. What she found wasn't really about the leaving. It was about what happened during the return. Children who had consistently responsive caregivers tended to settle quickly once the caregiver came back. Children who had experienced inconsistent or absent caregiving often couldn't settle, even once the person was standing right in front of them again. That detail matters more than it might seem. It suggests the wound isn't only about the absence itself. It's about what a child learns to expect from reunion, from closeness, from the moment right after distance. So if you've ever noticed that you struggle to relax even after someone proves they're not leaving, even after they come back again and again, this is very likely where that pattern began. When that internal map is built around absence and unpredictable return, the child doesn't just miss a person growing up. They lose something far more structural. They lose a mirror, the mirror that was supposed to reflect back, you're enough, you are loved, you are safe to take up space in this world. Without that reflection, something quietly breaks in how a person learns to measure their own worth. And that broken mirror doesn't announce itself. It just shows up, quietly, in everything. It shows up in the approval you chase from people who barely know you. It shows up in achievements that never quite satisfy, no matter how large they get. It shows up in relationships where you either hold on too tightly, terrified of losing someone, or push people away first, because leaving on your own terms hurts less than being left without warning. That's important to understand on its own, but if you don't also understand how this plays out in specific behavioral patterns, you'll keep recognizing the wound without knowing what to do with it. Because the wound doesn't look the same in everyone, and that's part of why it's so hard to identify in yourself. Some people carry it as hyperindependence, an inability to ask for help, a quiet belief that needing anyone at all is the same as being weak. They move apartments alone, carry boxes up flights of stairs alone, sit in waiting rooms before surgery alone, simply because asking for help feels more dangerous than the task itself. The logic underneath it is almost never conscious. It's just a body that learned, early, that counting on someone means setting yourself up to be left. Some carry it as people-pleasing, a constant performance of worthiness, hoping that if they're useful enough, agreeable enough, easy enough to be around, no one will ever decide they're not worth keeping. They say yes when they mean no. They apologize first, even when they did nothing wrong, because somewhere along the way being agreeable felt safer than being honest about what they actually needed. Some carry it as self-sabotage, which is the one that confuses people most from the outside. This is the pattern of getting close to something genuinely good, and then, almost without realizing it, finding a way to ruin it. Not because they don't want it, but because somewhere in their nervous system they learned that good things leave, So they leave first. They pick the fight right when things are calm. They find the flaw right when someone starts to truly know them. It looks like self-destruction from the outside, but from the inside it feels like self-protection. And some carry it as a hunger, a relentless, aching need for validation that no amount of praise ever fully satisfies. They can be told they did well 100 times and still feel the absence of the one voice that never said it. And the reason the praise doesn't satisfy them is because what they needed was never praise. It was presence. It was someone who stayed. There's also a specific and lesser-known finding worth including here, because specificity matters more than vague language when you're trying to understand something real. Researcher Sarah McClanahan, who has spent decades studying family structure and child outcomes, found a measurable increased risk of incarceration, specifically among young men raised in father-absent homes. That's a far more precise and sobering data point than the phrase behavioral problems, which usually gets used instead. This isn't included to frighten anyone. It's included because vague language lets people minimize what happened, and precise language forces honesty about the actual scale of the impact. But here's where the conversation usually goes wrong, even in well-meaning content. People assume father absence guarantees a fixed, permanent outcome, something set in stone the moment the absence occurred. Researcher Michael Lamb, who has published extensively on father involvement and child development, has pointed out that the long-term picture is actually far less settled than the short-term effects suggest. Some of the most measurable impacts show up clearly in early childhood and adolescence, but the long-term adult trajectory is shaped by many more factors than absence alone, including other relationships, other forms of support, and the meaning a person eventually makes of their own story. This is not Lamb saying the wound doesn't matter. It's Lamb saying the wound isn't the only variable. A grandmother who showed up consistently, a teacher who noticed, a friend's parent who, without ever being told the full story, simply treated you like you mattered. These things count. They don't erase what was missing, but they complicate the simple, fatalistic version of this story that says absence equals destiny. And if any of this is landing for you right now, if you're recognizing yourself in any of these patterns, drop a comment below. Seriously, because the number of people watching this who think they're alone in this experience is going to surprise you, and sometimes just seeing someone else name it is the thing that starts to shift it. So what actually changes this? Because that's the part most content on this topic either skips entirely or handles in a way that doesn't actually help. Here's what makes a father wound so difficult to heal. It isn't only about your father. It's about the story you built around his absence as a child, using a child's limited understanding of why adults do what they do. You couldn't have known, at 7 or 9 or 12, that his leaving had nothing to do with your value. You couldn't have known that absence is almost always about the person who leaves, their own unhealed wounds, their own fears, their own inability to show up for someone else when they couldn't even show up for themselves. You couldn't have known that, so you made it about you. And that story, the one that says you are somehow less, somehow not enough, somehow not worth staying for, has been running quietly in the background ever since, in ways you've noticed and in ways you haven't. The door forward is not going back, not finding a father somewhere who will finally give you what you needed decades ago. That door doesn't lead anywhere useful. The door that actually leads forward is the practice of becoming the parent you needed. Learning to offer yourself the steadiness, the presence, the unconditional regard that was missing. Psychologists call this reparenting, and it is not a metaphor or a soft concept. It is a real, daily, patient practice of meeting yourself with the kindness you were owed. And it looks smaller than you might expect. It looks like noticing the voice in your head that says you don't deserve rest, and choosing to rest anyway. It looks like staying in the room during conflict instead of leaving first, even when every instinct says to go. It looks like letting someone help carry the box up the stairs, just once, just to see what happens when you let yourself need something and the world doesn't end. None of this erases what happened. It doesn't rewrite the years you spent making his absence about your worth, but it does something quieter, and in its own way, more powerful. It starts to loosen the grip that old story has had on every choice you've made since. If this video opened something up for you, there's a related one on attachment styles that goes deeper into exactly how these early patterns show up in your adult relationships. It's worth watching next. And if you're not subscribed yet, this channel goes into this kind of psychology regularly, the kind that actually explains your behavior rather than just labeling it. You spent years wondering why a stranger's father at a graduation could make your throat tighten without warning. Now you know. It was never really about the stranger, or the graduation, or even your father. It was the moment years ago when a child decided they weren't worth staying for. And it's the moment, starting now, where you get to decide that was never true.